The air inside the Lancaster throbbed with relentless sound, the deep vibration of 4 Merlin engines, the trembling rattle through the fuselage, and beneath everything, the uneven rumble of distant flak bursts. Oxygen hissed through the rubber mask pressed tight against Arthur Walker's face, drying his mouth and fogging the edges of his goggles. He blinked twice, leaning over the navigation table where a faint red lamp drenched his charts in a dim spectral glow. The pencil snapped between his gloved fingers from pressure. Not fear, but frustration. Once again, they had drifted off course. At 18,000 feet, the night outside stretched endlessly black, broken only by flashes in the clouds and the sweeping fingers of searchlights wandering without purpose across the sky. The city below remained invisible, hidden under smoke and blackout. Somewhere in that darkness, countless guns waited, unseen but never silent. The nose of the bomber shifted slightly as the pilot corrected for crosswind. The intercom crackled and the bomb aimer's voice came through, sharp and controlled despite the tension. 2 minutes to target. Approaching the run now. Walker didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the clock. 3 minutes earlier, just after they'd crossed the Rhine, he'd corrected their heading. Using standard drift tables, he'd recalculated the wind speed. Yet something still felt off. Turbulence had thrown their bearings, and his last fix came too late. The math said they were still 30 seconds behind the planned turning point, which at this speed meant nearly half a mile of horizontal drift. He clenched the broken pencil stub tighter and tried to replot their position, but the seconds slipped away faster than he could reclaim them. The aircraft jolted violently. A muffled explosion boomed behind them. Flak, close. The lights flickered. Sweat gathered at the base of Walker's neck, soaking into the collar of his sheepskin jacket. The cold no longer registered. He reached for the stopwatch clipped to his board and checked it one last time. The second hand crawled unevenly, hesitating. His gut turned cold. It was sticking again. Below, the black sprawl of Essen had already erupted. Explosions flashed beneath veils of smoke like bursts of lightning. Fires from earlier raids still burned, flickering across the streets and casting ghostly shadows upward through the haze. They weren't the first tonight, and wouldn't be the last. But this moment mattered most. They were directly over the target, and whatever the bomb aimer said next would determine which lives vanished from the map. "Steady now. Hold it. Bombs away in 10. Walker shouted into the intercom. "We're off. Half a mile to port. Correction, 20 degrees. "Too late," came the curt reply. A metallic shudder rippled through the fuselage as the bay doors opened. The load fell. Silence followed. A heavy, absolute silence. For one long breath, Walker heard only the faint tick, tick, tick of the faulty stopwatch spinning down to 0, too late to help. Then the Lancaster banked sharply to starboard, diving away in evasive maneuver. Flak erupted all around. The sky blossomed with dirty orange bursts. The rear gunner cursed. A searchlight caught them briefly, then vanished as they dropped back into shadow. Walker looked down at his map and saw the plotted line curve too shallow. The bombs had landed wide. The factories still stood. When they returned, the report would call the mission complete. That was the word. Not missed, not failed, simply complete. But the reconnaissance photos would show the truth. Another costly sortie, another scattered pattern. Another night when calculations fell short and iron rained blind. He tore the mask from his face and drew a ragged breath as the freezing air filled his lungs. His hands trembled, but not from fear. That feeling had burned out long ago. The stopwatch rested on the table like a broken promise, its hands frozen mid-count. The numbers had been correct, the charts flawless. But time itself had betrayed him. Walker didn't utter a word for the rest of the flight. Not after they touched down, Not when the crew laughed, lit cigarettes, and clapped each other's shoulders with relief. He just sat at the navigator's desk, staring at the silent stopwatch, wondering how many lives had vanished between one tick and the next. And far behind them, across the dark fields of Europe, the fires of Essen still burned. The figures always looked perfect on paper. Wind drift, ground speed, true airspeed, compass bearing, all neatly calculated, verified, and plotted once more. Every bombing run began in numbers and ended in flames. The manuals called the process dead reckoning, a dramatic term for something built entirely on unseen forces. Navigators worked with compasses dulled by vibration, clocks stiff from frost, and wind charts where the ink blurred beneath sweat. In training halls, they solved triangles. Over Germany, they only hoped the ink hadn't lied. Arthur Walker never placed faith in prayers. He trusted precision. His pencil lines cut straight as blades, his course corrections flawless, yet after 11 sorties, that certainty had fractured. The stopwatch was part of the reason. RAF issue, brass-cased with black and red markings, meant to be a navigator's lifeline. It had jammed twice. Once it froze mid-leg. Another time it reset after striking the table. Neither incident had cost lives, but neither had been forgotten. Errors over cities like Hamburg or Essen weren't just about coordinates. They meant missed roofs, destroyed homes, wrong streets. A mistake of 1,000 yards could turn a target zone into a civilian block, or worse, nothing at all. Bomber Command's official measure of accuracy stretched by hundreds of yards. In early 1943, only a third of crews dropped within 500 yards of the aiming point. The rest scattered their loads across canals, tracks, housing, or the dark emptiness beyond. At High Wycombe, analysts called these deviations statistical anomalies. Crews called them failures. Walker said nothing. Yet every time they missed, something hollowed inside him. He remembered every failed run, the angles, the heights, the seconds lost. It was always seconds. 10 seconds misjudged at 200 miles per hour carried the bombs half a mile too far. Time was the one variable he couldn't measure, feel, or repair. Their instructors had warned them, 1 degree wrong at takeoff became disaster at impact. But timing ruined even perfect legs. A fraction of a second off could undo hours of flawless flight. G and oboe systems offered some relief, until the Luftwaffe learned to jam them. Stars became useless beneath the cloud. Over France and Belgium, Walker still trusted constellations. Over Germany, there was only smoke and fire. Technology hadn't caught up with the war's demands. Radar was primitive, compasses wavered near explosions, and celestial readings were impossible above the Ruhr's haze. Standard protocol failed nightly, yet the orders never changed. Plot, fix, run, release. No improvisation allowed. A navigator who deviated from doctrine was considered unreliable, even if his instincts saved the crew. During debriefs, questions always circled weather and altitude, never time. No one suspected the instruments. No one blamed the watches. But Walker knew the truth. That faulty stopwatch had cost them over Essen. His drift correction had been exact, only delivered too late. 10 seconds of delay had sent 5 tons of bombs across the wrong street. Other navigators whispered similar complaints. One said his watch slowed in freezing air. Another admitted his second hand froze mid-run. But no one dared to log it. The RAF didn't tolerate excuses. A shared joke, a muttered curse perhaps, but nothing written. Walker withdrew deeper into his own calculations. He started checking each wind reading thrice, building layered charts, adding margins everywhere. None of it helped. The flaw wasn't in the math. It hid inside the seconds. In that invisible gap between turns, where time slipped and lives vanished. The frustration gnawed at him, Every mission began the same: briefings, equipment checks, memorized routes. Every mission ended in numb silence and cold glass. It was those endless hours above hostile ground where time simply dissolved. And in that disappearing span, that narrow void between moments, Walker finally understood he was flying blind. Not because of fog, or night, or flak, but because his true enemy had no uniform, no orders, no mercy. Only a ticking hand that lied. The RAF kept sending him back. The stopwatch kept betraying him. And in the quiet pauses between the flak bursts, Walker stopped trusting the clocks and started watching the cooks instead. The mess hall carried the smell of boiled meat and burnt tea. Rain hammered the tin roof in uneven bursts, tapping against glass panes fogged by the warmth inside. Plates clinked, forks scraped, and a battered radio murmured the BBC through a haze of static near the back wall. Walker sat hunched over his tin tray, half listening, his eyes fixed on the untouched potatoes. Sleep clung to him like smoke, heavy and stubborn. At the next table, someone burst into laughter. A navigator from 12 Squadron was recounting how his stopwatch had jammed again, right as they crossed Dutch airspace. "Bloody cursed thing," he muttered, dragging his spoon through the gravy in a lazy circle. "Might as well wear a kitchen timer instead." The men around him laughed. Walker didn't. His hand froze mid-motion. That phrase struck somewhere deep inside his chest. Across the galley, a cook twisted the dial on a dented steel timer and dropped it onto the counter. Tick, 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 tick. Loud, steady, mechanical. The sound sliced through the chatter like a hammer striking wood. Walker's head turned sharply toward it. The cook barely noticed. He hummed softly, stacking trays while the ticking continued, echoing against pots and metal walls. Walker rose from his seat, leaving his tray behind, and walked slowly toward the counter. The timer sat beside a chipped enamel bowl, its dull metal gleaming under the yellow lamp. It ticked without pause, simple, reliable, absolute. No frost, no jams, no hesitation. He stood there for a long moment, staring, mind turning like the dial itself. That night, back in the dim barracks, Walker rummaged through his flight bag. At the bottom lay the issued stopwatch, cold, scratched, its casing dented and its glass cracked. He lifted it, turned the winder, and listened. Silence. The gears caught again. He struck it against the desk corner once, then twice. Dead. At 23:17, he left his bunk and moved quietly toward the kitchen. The door creaked open. Steam clung to the air, thick with the scent of cabbage and detergent. He stepped past rows of pans and paused by the counter. The galley was deserted. His hand lingered for a heartbeat, then reached forward. The timer was warm to the touch, solid and heavy. Only faint black numerals circled the dial. He slipped it into his coat pocket and left without a word. Back in his quarters, he set it beside his charts. The tick-tick-tick filled the silence, louder than he'd remembered, sharper somehow. He wound it twice, let it run out, then wound again. Timing it against his pocket watch, he found it precise to the second. No lag, no drag. Just steady rhythm and certainty. Sleep never came. He listened instead, following the timer's beat. Steady, alive, and human somehow. It felt like a pulse, a heartbeat beneath the instruments, something real. It carried weight, a kind of faith his issued watch had never earned. It was absurd, but it worked, and it ticked on through the night, daring him to trust it. At 03:02, he opened his navigation log and redrew a new set of timing legs. This time he marked them not by RAF intervals, but by the timer's capacity: 5 minutes, 7, 10. He recalculated for manual resets. It was crude but logical. It might just hold. There was no authorization process, no one to consult. If anyone saw it in use, he'd face grounding. Or worse. Unauthorized gear was a disciplinary offense. But Walker no longer cared. Essen had proved the system itself was broken. He would take the risk. His fingers trembled as he packed the timer into his flight bag the next morning. It clinked against the metal frame of his map board, louder than it should have been. He closed the zipper tight and looked across the airfield, where gray fog hung low over the wet tarmac like a shroud. Out there, another city waited in the dark. And for the first time in months, Walker carried something stronger than luck, a tool that ticked like a heartbeat, or a war drum. The airfield was shrouded in a low gray mist that reeked of fuel, mud, and burned rubber. Mechanics moved silently through it, their overalls drenched, their muffled voices drowned by the steady hum of idling engines. It was March 14th, 1943. The target was Stuttgart. Another long flight, another night of uncertainty above Germany. Walker climbed aboard the Lancaster, his breath curling into pale clouds in the icy dawn. He walked through the fuselage like a man entering a chapel, brushing past racks of flares, coiled oxygen hoses, and the thin frost glistening faintly on every surface. At his station, he buckled his harness, checked the drift tables, and placed the kitchen timer beside his maps. It looked ridiculous among the regulation instruments, a dull silver disc surrounded by compasses, rulers, and grease pencils. He wound it twice and listened. Tick, tick, tick. Loud, steady, unmistakable. Its mechanical rhythm filled the narrow cabin. The pilot turned his head, frowning behind his oxygen mask. What's that sound supposed to be? New timing aid, Walker answered without glancing up. His voice left no room for argument. The pilot said nothing more. They had all seen stranger ideas take shape in the dark. The engines roared to full power, shaking the entire frame. The runway lights vanished beneath the exhaust haze. The Lancaster climbed into the storm, rising steadily toward darkness. The cockpit temperature fell below freezing, and frost crept across the glass. Every surface of metal stung the skin. Walker's fingers stiffened, but he kept writing. Bearings, corrections, times, each note marked to the timer's relentless tick-tick-tick beside him. At 20,000 feet, the world shrank to sound alone. Engines, wind, and timer. He adjusted their heading, recalculated the drift, then wound the dial again. The rhythm gave him something no gauge ever had. Trust. He could hear every second instead of watching them vanish. The ticks became anchors holding him steady inside the void. Turning point in 30 seconds, he called. The pilot confirmed. Ahead, flak bursts winked like small orange blossoms across the horizon. The timer reached its final tick. Walker reset it, hands trembling slightly, and began the next leg. Turbulence struck. Maps slid off the table. He caught them mid-air, laid the ruler across the chart, and traced the line. Their course correction came precisely on time, not early, not late, but exact. Minutes stretched into hours. Below, clouds formed a dense gray carpet. No lights, no horizon, only darkness. When they finally reached the target zone, the bomb aimer's voice broke over the intercom. Target obscured. We're on dead reckoning. Walker's tone remained calm. Hold course. Counting down. 5, 4, 3. He gave the signal. The pilot steadied. The bomber groaned as the bay doors opened and an icy wind tore through the fuselage. The release switch clicked. The bombs fell cleanly away. Moments later, dull flashes bloomed below, glowing faintly through the cloud. Hours later, back at base, reconnaissance photos arrived. The railway junction had been struck directly. The rail yards were crippled, 2 warehouses gone, fuel depots burning. Not perfect, but effective. Walker said nothing. He wiped his instruments clean, rewound the timer, and set it gently in his bag. He didn't smile or speak during debrief. Yet something inside him shifted. That absurd little timer had endured cold, vibration, altitude, and fear, and never failed once. It had ticked through the worst hours of his life and led them home. He poured himself a cup of cold tea, his hands still unsteady. The air around him smelled of oil and metal, and beyond the hangar doors, the horizon was turning pale pink. For the first time, he believed the night could be beaten, not by luck or machinery, but by rhythm he could trust. He would fly again soon. The kitchen timer would fly with him, and somewhere above the clouds, its steady ticking would carve order out of chaos, 1 second at a time. The rumor spread quicker than any official order ever could. It started with a single glance. A rear gunner noticing something small and silver gripped in Walker's gloved hand during the Stuttgart mission. After landing, he mentioned it offhand, half amused. "Our navigator's flying with a kitchen clock," he joked to a mechanic while tugging off his frozen boots. The comment drew laughter, but one of those laughs came from another navigator who'd missed his drop by 3 minutes that night. By morning, he approached Walker, grinning nervously. "Mind if I borrow your miracle egg?" he asked. Before the next operation, 2 more crews had built their own makeshift versions. One tied a motorbike speedometer to his kneeboard. Another used the casing of a bicycle bell stuffed with watch parts. No 2 were alike, and none had any official sanction, but every one of them ticked, loudly, clearly, and without apology. When Squadron Leader Carr spotted the strange device strapped to Walker's knee during pre-flight inspection, his brow furrowed. "Where'd that come from?" "Cook's galley," Walker replied dryly. "Keeps better time than the issue's stopwatch." Carr didn't respond immediately. He stared for a moment, then gave a curt nod. That night, despite 90% cloud cover and relentless flak, Walker's bombs landed within 200 yards of the aiming point. Within a week, homemade timers had appeared in 6 Lancasters across the squadron. Crews filed down metal edges to stop rattling. Some wrapped them in cloth to muffle the sound. Others strapped them directly onto knee pads, navigator tables, or cockpit frames. The ticking became part of squadron life, a background rhythm to briefing jokes and midnight flights. No one documented it. No one asked permission. Then came the Bremen mission. Heavy fog blanketed the North Sea. G signals jammed. The target iced over. Out of 42 bombers, only 5 confirmed direct hits. 2 were Walker's crew and another team using a homemade timer. The intelligence officer flagged the coincidence with a red underline and quietly sent it up the chain. Headquarters issued no formal directive, but the question stopped. Not long after, a vague memo appeared at Maintenance Command. Ground crews to provide navigators with auxiliary mechanical countdown devices as available. No mention of timers, no details. Yet, soon, small metal cylinders began arriving in unmarked boxes. Inside were crude but reliable tickers, modeled after kitchen timers, fitted with cloth straps and coated with luminous paint for night use. They called it Manual Chronograph Number 2. There had never been a Number 1. No one cared. The crews laughed, nodded, and wound the dials. Each one ran for 10 minutes, could be rewound mid-flight, and gave a steady audible beat even through gloves and engine roar. In a war where silence often spelled death, the ticking became oddly reassuring. Still, problems came with it. Supplies ran short. Some timers cracked from vibration, others froze solid above 20,000 feet. Crews learned to carry spares. Engineers began modifying casings with rubber sleeves, wax seals, and extended springs. Even so, demand outpaced supply, and cooks stopped asking questions when their kitchen timers disappeared. One intelligence officer labeled the idea unauthorized innovation bordering on sabotage. Within a month, he was reassigned. By late April, Bomber Command wasn't laughing anymore. Navigation errors were dropping sharply. Missed targets grew fewer. Pilots began requesting the ticking devices before flying night missions. Senior officers took notice. A confidential report, never released publicly, contained one peculiar note scribbled in the margin. Precision not improved by radio, improved by sound. The louder, the better. Something crude, ridiculous, and entirely unapproved had taken hold in the very heart of the night war. It had no manual, no patent, only noise born of necessity. And the men who flew through flame and darkness now moved to its rhythm. Walker said nothing about it. He simply kept winding. The tarmac shone beneath the floodlights, slick with rain and streaked with oil. Mechanics moved like shadows between the roaring engines, their soaked overalls clinging to them, faces streaked with grime and exhaust. The date was May 27, 1943. Operation Bellicose had been approved at noon. That night, Lancaster bombers would strike the Zeppelin works in Friedrichshafen, then press south over the Alps to La Spezia, a rare two-phase assault demanding flawless timing across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. Walker had slept barely 90 minutes. His hands shook as he tightened the straps of his flight bag. Inside, the latest version of the ticking device rested. Wrapped in waxed canvas, reinforced with a new coil, its luminous numbers hand-painted by an airframe mechanic. He'd used it on 3 earlier sorties. It had never failed. But tonight felt different. The briefing was brief, clinical, and heavy with tension. No moon, no radio navigation past the French border, no second chances. Their flight plan carried 79 precise timing points. Miss even one, and the second phase would collapse before reaching bombing altitude. Each crew received a sealed order. Drop within 90 seconds of the signal, or abort the run. At 21:53, Walker's Lancaster climbed into dense cloud. The light vanished instantly, the cabin fading from gray to absolute black. Oxygen masks hissed softly. Frost crept across the edges of glass. They reached altitude over Luxembourg with visibility at 0. Static flared across the radar screen. The stars were gone. But Walker didn't need them. He wound the timer, locked his hand around the dial, and pressed the first switch. The clicking began. Steady, harsh, insistent. Wind clawed against the fuselage, and the chart table shuddered as turbulence rolled through. A tin cup rattled loose and shattered somewhere near the tail. "Course correction in 8 seconds," Walker shouted. "Adjust heading to 155, reduce airspeed by 2 knots. The pilot obeyed immediately. No hesitation, no questions. The ticking was louder than the storm outside. As they neared Friedrichshafen, the flak started. Bursts of yellow tore across the sky. The guns below couldn't see them, but luck didn't need sight. A Lancaster ahead went up in fire. Another broke formation, burning, trailing metal. Walker didn't move. He was counting. The timer marked the final seconds of approach. 5 miles. 3. 1. "Hold steady," he said. "Release on 0. The bomb doors opened with a deep, metallic groan. Cold air screamed through the fuselage. The timer clicked down. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Now. The bombs fell clean. Silence followed. That thick, final silence before impact. Then the shock wave reached them as explosions rolled beneath the clouds. A factory roof folded inward. A hangar vanished in flame. There was no time to verify. They turned south toward the Alps. The second strike depended on perfect synchronization. No radar, no beacons, only the ticking. The old methods would have failed. The timers did not. At cruising height above the mountains, frost sealed the windows into sheets of white. The altimeter wavered. Fuel gauges flickered. The aircraft shuddered violently in updrafts. Walker's pencil snapped as he wrote. He rewound the timer with bleeding fingers, smearing red against the steel surface. They reached La Spezia under total blackout. Fires from an earlier raid smoldered low. Searchlights groped through the clouds, but found nothing. "All flights execute drop pattern Delta in 12 seconds, came the final transmission. Walker whispered the countdown. His voice disappeared in the thunder of engines, but the ticking stayed steady. The bombs fell once more. Precise, lethal, controlled. The harbor erupted in light like a false sunrise. On the return leg, they flew blind. Fuel nearly gone. Instruments failing. The altimeter froze at 11,000 feet. They descended manually over the channel, plunging into a dense fog bank. No one spoke. Only Walker's hand moved, resetting the timer for their final approach pattern. They landed on fumes, frost glazing the controls. Mechanics hauled them from the bomber one by one. The air smelled of petrol and burned rubber. Their Lancaster had taken 6 hits. 2 shell holes were inches from Walker's seat. The mission was declared a success. Both targets confirmed destroyed. Command gave no medals, no mentions. No one spoke of the ticking devices. Yet every navigator who survived requested one before flying again. Something crude, simple, and mechanical had surpassed everything electrical. And now, no one dared take off without it. The war dragged on, untouched by invention or fatigue. By mid-1944, Bomber Command's night offensives reached deeper into Germany, and accuracy reports began to shift. Targets once missed by miles were now being hit within mere hundreds of yards. Analysts credited improved crew discipline. Walker knew the truth. Discipline hadn't changed. The rhythm had. He had completed 36 sorties. His logbook was thick, its pages stiff with sweat, graphite, and oil stains. The timer had never once betrayed him. Its ticking had fused with his mind, a sound that followed him long after landing. Sometimes, during briefings, he realized he was breathing in time with its beat. The awareness unsettled him, but stopping wasn't possible. At Scampton, a new wave of crews arrived fresh from training school. Boys, really, faces still unlined, eyes wide with that mix of dread and eagerness. They whispered about Walker's egg clock, trading the tale in mess halls and bunks like contraband. A few brave ones approached him quietly, asking whether the stories were true. He never confirmed or denied. Yet, some nights, after lights out, he'd leave one of his spare timers on a desk or slip it into an open flight bag. By dawn, it was always gone. No one in authority acknowledged the practice, but the devices multiplied all the same. Ground mechanics began crafting their own versions from scavenged alarms, broken gauges, and salvaged springs. Each one ticked a little differently, some faster, some slower, some with a sharper tone, yet all carried the same pulse. The sound united them, linking aircraft scattered miles apart, hundreds of unseen men keeping time to the same invisible metronome. Then came the inspection. The Group Captain Redding arrived unannounced, immaculate and cold as polished steel. When he spotted a timer fixed to a navigator's table, he halted mid-sentence. "What is this device?" he barked. Silence followed. Walker stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Manual chronograph, sir. Helps retain timing accuracy under vibration." Redding's expression didn't soften. "Non-standard equipment. Remove it." He turned as if to go, but the intelligence officer beside him leaned in, murmuring something too faint to hear. The captain hesitated, eyes narrowing, then gave a single curt nod before walking on. The timer remained untouched. That evening, Redding joined a test crew for a night exercise. They flew with one of the ticking devices. Their navigation run came back accurate to the exact second. His report afterward gave no technical reasoning, just 2 words scribbled beside the mission summary. Maintain issue. Walker never earned a medal or even a mention. His name appeared in no official document, Yet the knowledge spread quietly through squadrons, passed between survivors and whispered before takeoff. Every navigator who wound a timer afterward did so with silent gratitude to an unknown hand. By autumn, the mechanical countdown tool had become standard kit under a new name: Interval Recorder, Type B. It carried no patent, no credit line, no ceremony. But its design matched Walker's original galley timer exactly. The same rounded dial, the same faintly glowing numerals. He flew his final operation that December, a brutal night over Leipzig. Flak burst so close it tore the radio mast clean away. They limped home with half a wing missing and engines choked by ice. When the bomber finally touched down, Walker didn't move right away. He stayed seated in darkness, listening as the timer wound down for the last time. The ticking slowed, then ended with a soft metallic click. Silence filled the cabin. He pulled off his gloves, set the timer on the chart table, and rested his palm on its cool casing. Outside, floodlights flickered through the fog. Men shouted orders, engines growled, and somewhere far across the field a siren wailed. But inside the cockpit there was nothing, only stillness and the fading echo of a rhythm that had once kept hundreds of air crews alive in the black. He left it there when he climbed out. No farewell, no note, no words, only the quiet absence of a ticking that no one would ever quite forget. The war ended in both flame and silence. Cities that once shook with sirens and falling bombs now lay motionless beneath layers of soot and shattered stone. Rail lines broke apart through cratered ground. Factories stood gutted, hollow shells of what they had been. And in the skies, where hundreds of Lancasters had once thundered together, the stars returned, cold and unblinking. The ticking had stopped, yet its echo endured. Arthur Walker never mentioned the timer again. He left the service in early 1945, thinner, hollow-eyed, his chest bare of medals and his lips empty of stories. He took a quiet clerk's job in Manchester and lived alone above a corner shop. For years, he spoke little to anyone, but now and then, passing through a grocery aisle, he would pause by the kitchen timers, his thumb grazing the dials before he realized he was doing it. The device itself disappeared. The one he left in the cockpit was taken by ground crew, perhaps lost in transit, perhaps kept as a souvenir. It didn't matter. The idea had already taken flight. It spread from squadron to squadron, crossed oceans into American bomb groups, and eventually found its way east through Soviet engineers and silent observation. By 1946, the RAF had quietly incorporated cockpit countdown mechanisms into all new bomber models. Official reports describe them as developed from operational experience under high-stress conditions. No author listed, no credit given. Yet their construction mirrored Walker's: loud, mechanical, simple, and utterly reliable. At RAF Cranwell, instructors began training cadets with a device called the interval regulator. It was painted black, fitted with a canvas strap, and stamped with an untraceable serial number. Some joked it was the egg that cracked the night. Others treated it with reverence, teaching young navigators to wind it carefully, to listen for the rhythm, to trust the sound when every other instrument failed. In a small museum near Lincolnshire, behind glass streaked with dust, sits a battered steel timer, its casing dented, its numbers faded, its mechanism long removed. There's no official label, only a handwritten tag that reads, Navigator's Personal Equipment 1943. Visitors pass by it each day without stopping. It looks ordinary. No medals, no plaque, no name. But among veterans, the object is remembered. Quietly, with respect and without ceremony. They recall the weight of it, the sound it made in the darkness, the seconds it counted between survival and destruction. It had no switch, no current, no encryption. Only springs, steel, and resolve. Modern aircraft now rely on digital systems, timers built into displays, navigation tied to satellites, precision handled by machines. Yet the same principle endures. Precision must be trusted, not merely computed. Pilots still train with backup routines, some involving manual countdowns, not because they expect failure, but because someone once made accuracy survive it. Walker died in 1972. There was no obituary, no public notice, no mention of his 36 missions. His name appears only once in Bomber Command's archives, linked to a reconnaissance note about an unusually accurate bombing run over Stuttgart. But in the private notebook of a retired group captain, between weather logs and wind calculations, a single handwritten line remains. Kitchen egg, first tested by Walker, saved more than we'll ever know. The original timer no longer ticks, its gears seized decades ago, but its rhythm lives on. In flight school procedures, in the cadence of launch sequences, in the heartbeat of aircraft cutting through the sky with precision born from necessity. And if one listens carefully, somewhere between the engines, a faint rhythm still lingers, steady, mechanical, and certain.